All right, hello, History 362. So today I want to talk a little bit about intellectual developments in the Hellenistic period, namely developments in Greek philosophy. And I think one thing that's sort of important to remember is that while the 4th century is this really kind of axial moment in Greek philosophy, which sees the foundation of the first philosophical schools, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum. There are tremendous developments in the Hellenistic era. And in some ways, the Hellenistic era is really one of the most vibrant and creative and foundational periods in Greek philosophical thought. Importantly, those philosophical schools from the 4th century continue into the Hellenistic era. And by schools, I think I should step back. These are not formal institutions like the University of Albany that have official hierarchies and accept students and give degrees or credentials. These are not like colleges or universities. They are at most sort of philosophical clubs. Oftentimes they do have a designated leader, but really they're kind of a club of people who might range from kind of students to hobbyists who all sort of share an affinity for the kind of philosophical thought that's associated with the school. But as academic institutions, they are still relatively informal. A few will collect dues or fees, although again, not tuition. But that's only to sort of maintain the club in some ways that I say a club might collect dues or fees. Now, the Academy of Plato, which is basically based in Plato's house on the Academus Hill in Athens, and also is associated with a nearby gymnasium, continues under a sort of series of leaders who are the successor of Plato. One notable shift in the thought, and here, while everyone sort of who's attracted to these philosophical schools or philosophical clubs, oftentimes has a certain kind of philosophical orientation, things are fluid and flexible enough that the thought of these schools oftentimes undergoes evolution and change. And one evolution that takes place in academic philosophy is a trend over the course of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC towards skepticism. The idea that it is impossible to know anything, including it is impossible to know that you don't know anything at all. So skeptics, academic skeptics, are eventually so skeptical that they are skeptical of their own skepticism. They have doubt about their own doubt. And this skepticism, on one hand, is part of a kind of querying and questioning sort of all assumptions and about knowledge. Now that being said, you might say, well, how do these skeptics go through their day? Generally, academic skeptics they say, okay, we can't know anything, including we can't know our own ignorance even. Oftentimes they treat the world as a certain number of for pragmatic reasons, they kind of treat reality as a kind of working hypothesis, a set of assumptions that maybe they have to run with to just get through their day, even if at a philosophical level they refuse any claim to absolute knowledge or certainty. So that's kind of a trend over the Hellenistic period of Plato's Academy. The other school, kind of again, I'm using the term club just to kind of make it a little more alien, since we think we know what a school is in modern language, even though they're generally called schools. The other school is the Lyceum, which is the house on the Lyceum Hill of Athens, where Aristotle and his friends meet. And Aristotle is actually a real transitional figure in between the classical world and the Hellenistic world. After all, he leaves Athens to go up and be a tutor to none other than Alexander the Great. He remains good friends to the end of his life with Antipater, the regent over the viceroy over Macedonia and subsequent regent for the kings. And then after Aristotle dies, he is succeeded by Theophrastus, who is perhaps the most notable sort of successor of Aristotle, of the Lyceum school. And of course, one thing that Aristotle was known for was his empiricism. That is, unlike Plato, who sort of works for these sort of big, grand theories about forms, Aristotle was really interested in starting with the observable facts and then developing things up from there. And so Theophrastus, the works of his that chunks survive, are actually a very empirical in nature. They're about botany, the careful study of plants. That is probably the closest we get to, say, science in the ancient world. And this is being done in the late 4th and into the early 3rd centuries BC. So we have the continuation of these sort of two classical schools. We also see an efflorescence of new forms of philosophical thought, which again congeal into both schools that again are sometimes based in Athens, and also sort of they oftentimes start to transcend a particular sort of club in Athens to become kind of movements or even lifestyles. And indeed, the most lifestyle of all of these new schools is cynicism. And cynicism is associated with a rather eccentric figure named Diogenes of Sinope. And Diogenes comes to live in Athens. And Diogenes, again, rather than practicing a kind of intellectual philosophy, really more practices a kind of, again, alternative lifestyle. He wants to show the vanity and vacuity of human institutions, of human conventions. Therefore, he practices an ascetic lifestyle, embracing poverty rather than trying to flaunt worldly goods. He also deliberately flouts basic human conventions. He'll do things like defecate in public, urinate in public, masturbate in public, have sex with a hetaira in public. And he does all of this in some ways to simply show that these are human conventions, and that his argument is that he's simply engaging in natural, normal bodily functions that shouldn't be necessarily constrained by human ideas of we say privacy. And it's for this reason that he's called a kunos, a dog. And that's where we get our term cynicism, cynic. And of course, eventually our term cynicism, which kind of, I think, has become a little detached from the original kind of lifestyle of Diogenes, to sort of simply mean someone who's kind of has dark, pessimistic view of society and human intention. So Diogenes of Sinope doesn't actually have a school in the former sense in the way that, say, Plato or Aristotle do, but he does inspire a number of imitators, many again who practice a kind of asceticism, poverty, and again engage in this kind of alternate lifestyle. And so there will be this strand of cynic thought and behavior that continues on after Diogenes is gone. Incidentally, a famous anecdote that may or may not be true about Diogenes of Sinope and Alexander the Great. Supposedly, when Alexander the Great comes to Corinth after to assume command of the League of Corinth, he says, "Well, I hear there's this famous guy named Diogenes, and let's go see him." So they find Diogenes, and Diogenes, as part of his lifestyle, lives in a tub. And is sunbathing by his tub, and Alexander walks up and sort of looms over Diogenes and says, "I'm Alexander the Great, and I'm a big, powerful king, and I will give you anything that you want." And Diogenes looks up and, without missing a beat, says, "Well then, step aside, please, because you're blocking my sun." So Alexander the Great and his companions go off, and his friends are laughing at this sort of silly philosopher. And supposedly Alexander says something along the lines of, "Don't mock him. If I weren't Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Probably too good to be true, but does suggest that there was an appeal to elites about the sort of purity of Diogenes' again, very performative alternative lifestyle. Now, two other schools, which are somewhat more formal, they more resemble kind of clubs, although they also have a kind of ethical and lifestyle aspect associated with them, that form in the Hellenistic world, are Stoicism and Epicureanism. And so Stoicism is a school club founded by a guy named Zeno of Citium, and the Stoics initially hang out around the Stoa Poikile, that painted Stoa in Athens. That's where they get the name. And Zeno, again, seems to have a wide array of precepts. One problem with Stoicism is we've actually lost a great deal of the actual Hellenistic writings. And indeed, our best vision of Stoicism, our most complete encapsulation of Stoic philosophy, comes from the High Roman Empire, from two authors. Firstly, Epictetus, a freed imperial slave, and secondly, none other than the Emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, who writes a Stoic kind of diary, personal self-help guide, which we usually refer to as the Meditations. And so those are our most complete views of Stoicism. Suffice to say, Stoics believe essentially that the universe has its own set immutable path, its own logic, which they call the Logos. The Logos in the universe, Logos can mean word. It's actually where we get our term logic. It's actually the same word as in the Gospel of John. In the beginning there was the Word. In the beginning there was the Logos. But the Logos for Stoic philosophers, again, is this kind of immutable course of events that the universe takes. That is the Logos. And there is no fighting the Logos or resisting the Logos. And therefore, the goal of a philosophical person is to look inwards and essentially realize that what's going to happen is going to happen, and your goal is to train yourself to accept it with a degree of calm. Not try to necessarily change the course of events, but simply to accept them. And so in this way, at times this can suggest a kind of passive response to events. And indeed, there have been some who've argued that the rise of Stoicism is a symptom of the decline of the polis, right? That once the Athenians lose the ability to control the Aegean like they had in the good old days of the 5th century, they start sort of having this kind of passive inward philosophy. Maybe. One reason to doubt that, though, is the fact that, again, our most complete encapsulation of Stoic thought comes from none other than the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world in his day, a man who has far more agency and control than anyone else. And if anything, Stoicism in some ways is a kind of philosophy for men who are themselves actually quite powerful. Notably, it is very much sort of negates against trying to make the world a better place or to engage, fight for social justice or to engage in reform. You're supposed to accept kind of how things are, but by looking inwards, it seems to encourage powerful men who at times feel the limits of their power to stop and essentially kind of try to calm down a little bit. So it's actually, I think, rather than appealing to people who've lost their agency, it likely is a philosophy that appeals to people who have a tremendous amount of agency, eventually the Emperor of Rome, but also start to have to grapple with the frustrations as they realize the limits of their power and control over the wider world. So that is Stoicism. Another, again, kind of ethical school that also is found in Athens is Epicureanism. And this is founded by a philosopher named Epicurus, who, again, there is a kind of circle club that is associated with his home garden. So again, if it's a school, it's a very informal school, a group of friends and compatriots meeting to discuss, even if it eventually, as with Stoicism and Cynicism, becomes a kind of untethered intellectual movement. So that people across both the Hellenistic world and eventually the Roman world feel like they can practice skepticism or Stoicism or Epicureanism. Epicureans have a rather different metaphysics. So Epicureans believe that there are gods, but the gods are distant and they are indifferent to human affairs, and they make no attempt to intervene. Furthermore, Epicureans believe that there is no immortal soul. They believe your soul, the Epicureans have an atomic theory. They believe your soul is simply made of atoms of a certain sort, and eventually upon death, the atoms of the soul disperse just like all other matter. So if the gods are indifferent and have no interest in human affairs, and if there is no immortal soul that you have to worry about, how should you behave? Well, for Epicureans, the answer is, again, also kind of inward-looking. You should really focus on the sweetness of human life. And sweetness is hedos, and this is where we get our term hedonism. So Epicureans therefore believe in practicing hedonism, and that's why Epicureanism has kind of become synonymous for a kind of generally very physical hedonism. If you were, I'm an Epicurean, often they're saying, I really like good food or good wine or other things. But it's notable that for Epicureans, they, generally realized that, the goal was not simply to eat a tremendous amount of food or drink a tremendous amount of wine, but to actually sort of bring a kind of internal calm, which was seen as the most pleasurable sensation, not being roaringly drunk or profoundly full, but rather being calm, at ease. And indeed, really one of the highest goods that Epicureans sought wasn't just food or drink or sex, but it was rather friendship. That was seen as the ultimate sweetness of life that Epicureans are pursuing in the absence of any kind of divine plan or divine will, and with the idea that the soul itself, the Epicureans believe that there's a kind of physical soul sort of beating within you, but that soul dies with you. So because of that, all you should focus on is the sweetness of the moment, primarily the friendship, the relationship with your friends. And in some ways, Epicureanism is maybe the most humane of all these new Greek philosophies, encouraging, not just focusing on the sweetness of the moment, but encouraging its followers to focus on one another. Now, again, it's unfortunate that our best understanding of Epicurus comes not from Hellenistic writings, but again from Roman writings, namely the long and quite unusual poem by the late Republican author Lucretius. He's a contemporary of Julius Caesar, who writes this Latin poem of Epicurean discourse that sort of preserves our best encapsulation of that philosophy. So suffice to say, these developments which are taking place in the late 4th and into the 3rd century and beyond actually show that the Hellenistic period is this incredibly just productive time for Greek philosophy. It's a creative time as whole new ideas and even new ethical ways of living are being put forward. And of course, those will continue to echo both into the Roman Empire and beyond. All right, so that's all for this week. I may talk about a few more issues of culture and society, and then we'll kind of get back on track with our narrative as we deal with Rome entering the Greek East. Have a good weekend.